Imagine a republic feared and envied around the world, where ordinary hard-working citizens have a voice, where law, order and justice prevail, most of the time anyway. A system that stands for freedom and opportunity for its citizens. But then it ripped itself apart, not in a single moment, not by foreign armies, but through riots, political violence, major demographic shifts, and finally, civil war and the end of democratic principles. Romans didn't suddenly wake up one day to see an emperor on the throne. They watched as their republic was bled dry in the streets, while leaders on both sides promised to save it. And when the dust settled, the republic was gone. Yet most Romans believed that their republic had finally become great again. Let's rewind to around 300 BC, Rome's golden age, a time when the system actually worked for the little man. Picture yourself as an average Roman citizen, not a toga-clad aristocrat, but a plebeian with dirt under your nails. You've got a farm, not a large estate, but a plot big enough to feed your family and live a good Roman life. Or perhaps you run a small shop in the city making pottery or working with leather, and you have some small say in how Rome is run. This culture traced back to 509 BC, when the Romans kicked out their last king, Tarquin the Proud. The tyrant was so hated that they turned Rex into a profanity, and for 500 years calling someone a wannabe king was worse than accusing him of murder. Their rejection of monarchy was absolute central to Roman identity. No one wanted a crown back in power, and everyone agreed that Rome belonged to every Roman. Sure, some were more equal than others, but every citizen was free. These republican principles built real safeguards for folks like you and I. Elected from the common people, the plebeian council and the tribune of the plebs had gained unprecedented powers. They could summon the aristocratic senate, propose and pass relevant legislation, intervene on behalf of plebs in legal matters, and even veto consuls and other magistrates. Additionally, members of the tribune were sacrosanct, meaning harming them was a serious crime against the gods and the state. And over time, even the aristocratic senate opened up a bit too. It was no longer just for the old elite, but for a broader selection of ambitious Romans, allowing for somewhat more competition in politics. Things were far from perfect, of course, but the common citizen of 300 BC had seen significant improvements and would have had real reason for optimism. A growing middle class of farmers and skilled workers had emerged, and property was more evenly shared among citizens than ever before. As a farmer soldier, you might fight a seasonal war, come home, and your farm would still be waiting for you. Everyone's got skin in the game. This made the Republic solid. Of course, there were frictions between the classes, but they all shared the same fundamental republican values. And more important, there was agreement on how disagreements should be handled, not by the gladius, but through the law, negotiations, and sorta democratic-ish principles. War was something you waged against foreigners, not your own people. Or as Scipio Africanus put it according to Cicero, the Republic belongs to the people, but the people are not just any group of people. They are a community bound by shared laws and a common purpose. But then cracks started showing. In just a generation or two, the Roman middle-class dream went up in flames. By 133 BC, Rome had transformed into an oligarchy in all but name. A small group of elite families, like the Metelli, the Julii, the Cornelii and the Claudii, dominated political offices, reducing real competition. This happened largely because of Rome's endless wars of expansion, which massively enriched a tiny elite while destroying the lives of ordinary Romans. These wars, especially the Punic Wars, left large parts of Italy in ruins. Farmer soldiers who had once left for a season of military service were now forced to stay away for years, sometimes decades. Many returned to find their farms neglected and overgrown, while others found their lands ravaged by invading armies, such as during Hannibal's campaigns in Italy. Picture this. Carthage burns to ash after Rome's final victory. Loud cheers in the forum, but at home, a returning farmer stares at his ruined fields, torched by a raiding army years before. On top of that, many came home to crushing debt, unable to rebuild what had been lost. Creditors charged exorbitant interest rates, making payment nearly impossible. Many were forced to sell their land, while others simply abandoned their farms, having no means to restore them. Then a few wealthy Romans took advantage of the situation. They scooped up vast tracts of land, either claiming abandoned fields or buying out struggling farmers for pennies on the dollar, for asses on the denarius. To add insult to injury, the continuous military campaigns flooded the Roman countryside with slaves captured in war. These slaves provided cheap labour who worked large estates known as latifundia, which churned out goods at prices so low that small free farms simply couldn't compete. As more and more small landowners lost their property, they were displaced to the cities, particularly Rome. This growing class of urban poor became increasingly reliant on handouts from wealthy patrons. This, in turn, made them useful pawns for ambitious elites, eager to win their loyalty and wield it to dominate the political game. So, with wealth and land increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, political power followed the same trajectory, and by 133 BC the Republic was firmly in the grip of an entrenched elite. The elites had won, or so they thought, until one man started a revolution and broke everything holding Rome together. Because here's the thing, Rome was still a republic. The laws, traditions, and institutions remained very much intact. The oligarchs simply learned how to take advantage of the situation. This is not what killed the Republic. Instead, when the common people finally fought back, they themselves shattered its fundamental principles. The death of the Republic was, in many ways, a result of their own actions, though one could argue that it was inevitable, given the demographic and economic shifts they endured. The fall began with the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, two politicians from a distinguished but populist-leaning family. While travelling through Etruria, which is modern-day Tuscany, on his way to military service in Spain, the older brother Tiberius noticed that Roman citizens had been almost entirely replaced. The sight of large estates staffed by foreign slaves instead of Roman farmers was a powerful reminder of how deeply Rome had transformed in just a few decades. According to Plutarch, this experience struck Tiberius as a great injustice, as well as a threat to Rome's stability, as small, loyal farmers had traditionally been the backbone of both Rome's economy and its citizen army. So Tiberius decided to reverse the situation through redistribution of land. He proposed a law that would set an upper limit of about 300 acres per individual and allocate the excess to landless citizens. To him, this wasn't about seizing private property, but reclaiming land that the wealthy had illegally taken, which, by the way, was based in existing laws that were rarely enforced. However, in trying to return Rome to what it used to be, Tiberius broke long-standing political tradition. Instead of giving the Senate a chance to discuss his bill, he ignored them entirely and brought it directly to the plebeian assembly for a vote. This was technically legal, but he violated Republican norms and set a dangerous precedent for bypassing traditional debate. But that wasn't all. Tribune Marcus Octavius vetoed Tiberius's bill, which was his legal right. But Tiberius refused to accept the veto. Instead, he called a vote in the plebeian assembly to depose Octavius from office and have him forcibly removed, something that had never been done. Tribunes were sacrosanct, remember? And removing one for political reasons was highly illegal. By doing this, Tiberius showed that tribunes could simply be removed if they opposed someone stronger. Then, after finally getting his law through, you'd think Tiberius was done playing with fire. But he needed money for the redistribution project, so he challenged yet another key Senate authority, control over public funds. So when the king of Pergamum died and left his kingdom to Rome, Tiberius proposed that the assembly, not the Senate, should control this newfound wealth to finance his land reform program. This directly undermined the Senate yet again, further escalating tensions. Then, rightfully fearing that his political opponents would undo his reforms, Tiberius ran for re-election as tribune for a second consecutive term, a move that was not strictly illegal but highly unusual and seen as breaking with mos maiorum, or ancestral custom. No tribune had ever served back-to-back terms, and many in the Senate saw this as Tiberius trying to make himself king. But perhaps most damaging to the Republic, Tiberius started using mob tactics in politics, gathering large crowds of supporters to intimidate opponents. These aggressive tactics escalated, and reports suggest his allies even brought weapons on election day. breaking the Roman tradition that political assemblies should be peaceful places for debate. Before Tiberius, public protests were common but generally followed accepted rules and weren't usually threatening. Tiberius' approach marked a major shift as he used his supporters to intimidate opponents and bypass normal Senate procedures, leading to increased political violence. So by ignoring Senate authority, undermining the legal veto, and using mob threats, Tiberius Gracchus showed that political power could be grabbed through force and ignoring common rules, paving the way for future strongmen and the eventual collapse of the Republic. At this point, the Senate essentially concluded that if our opponents no longer respect the rules, then all bets are off. We have to do the same or we'll lose. Then a group of senators and their supporters stormed the forum and beat Tiberius to death with clubs, stones, and chairs, marking the first major case of political violence in the Roman Republic. In other words, when people lost respect for the laws and norms of the Republic, Rome split into irreconcilable camps, and politics turned into a complete disregard for law on both sides, bowing only to the rule of the strongest. For years after Tiberius's death, Rome saw escalating social conflict, violent power struggles, and incredible levels of corruption. The people needed order, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla was there to provide. The aristocratic general did something unthinkable. He turned his armies against Rome itself, twice. With blood-stained boots, Sulla marched across the sacred boundary of the city, breaking a ban going back to Romulus himself, proving that a loyal army was more powerful than any law. The plebs had pushed too far, and they were in trouble since politics now came down to who had the most weapons. As dictator, Sulla purged those who had defied traditional structures. He stripped the tribune of the plebs of most of its power, stopping former tribunes from holding higher office and severely limiting their ability to pass laws. Sulla wasn't a king, though, and he stepped down after severely limiting the power of regular citizens. Romans still hated the idea of kings, but at the same time, their respect for republican principles was basically gone. And once rules don't matter anymore, the only way to win is to break them. Sulla's use of force to take power encouraged later leaders like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar to do the same. As groups increasingly relied on military strength rather than negotiation and compromise, the Republic descended into a series of civil wars. First, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar formed an informal alliance, bypassing the Senate to consolidate power. This arrangement undermined the republican legal system, reducing the Senate to a mere formality. After Crassus died and tensions grew between Caesar and Pompey, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC to seize Rome, starting a civil war. After defeating Pompey's forces, Caesar declared himself dictator for life, further dismantling the Republic, and his assassination in 44 BC by senators who wanted to restore the Republic only threw Rome into more chaos. Octavian, later known as Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus then formed the Second Triumvirate, completely sidelining the Senate. Their purges and power struggles led to war between Octavian and Antony, ending with Octavian's victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Ultimately, Caesar's assassination paved the way for Octavian, now Augustus, to rise to power as emperor, marking the definitive end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the empire. In our Monday morning quarterbacking, it's easy to see that the Republic was now effectively dead. But to most Romans, the Republic seemed very much alive, and Augustus was careful to maintain that illusion to avoid his adopted father Julius Caesar's fate. He completely rejected the title of Rex, instead calling himself Princeps, or First Citizen, presenting himself as a servant of the Republic rather than a ruler, similar to how communist dictators call themselves chairman or first secretary. In fact, Augustus was an expert at creating the appearance of republicanism. He kept the Senate, though it had lost most of its real power, and most Republican senators had been purged long ago. Traditional offices like consul, praetor, and tribune were also preserved, with Augustus himself often holding key positions to maintain legitimacy, giving him complete control without seeming like a tyrant. The assemblies continued too. Their influence decreased, but the plebeian and centuriate assemblies still met, and formally approved laws which gave the impression that nothing had changed. Basically, Augustus was taking what had been a check on power and turning it into a tool of imperial rule. In addition to all of that, Augustus also portrayed his reign as a return to the moral and political stability of the early republic, emphasizing traditional Roman ideas, religious revival, and laws supporting family values. Under his rule, Rome's economy thrived, and its military was reorganized into a more professional force, ensuring long-term stability. He used literature, art, and public works to cement the idea that he had saved the republic while actually centralizing power. Also, the end of the civil wars made his reign feel like a welcome return to order, further strengthening the belief that Rome had restored its past greatness. But perhaps most importantly, Augustus took several steps to ensure support from regular people, including large public works projects that provided jobs, expanding free grain distributions to support the urban poor, and giving land to veterans and lower-class citizens. Additionally, he funded entertainment like gladiatorial games and festivals, building his image as a good leader who cared for the common people with lots of bread and circuses. So it's likely that ordinary Romans didn't care much about losing a republican democracy that they didn't have much influence over anyway. Sure, they valued democracy in theory, but they also valued that a strong man had taken over and brought peace and stability. If you asked an ordinary Roman like this vegetable seller, he'd probably have said something like this: "Look, I don't care what the corrupt senators whisper about democracy. I never had a say anyway. Augustus stopped the endless wars, put bread in my hands, and gave my cousin a plot of land after soldiering. The streets are safer, the games are awesome. He fixed Rome, made it great again, temples shining, strong family values. Besides, he doesn't even act like a king, so what's the problem? As far as I'm concerned, the Republic's doing just fine with him leading it." And so the Republic fell. Thank you for watching.